Russia has entered an economic recession, with its industry contracting and inflation remaining in double digits, while new sanctions packages are being prepared over the invasion of Ukraine. Are these measures finally achieving their objective? Or will Russia continue to defy Western expectations and estimates, while the countries that impose them suffer further damage? On February 24, 2022, Russia announced the invasion of Ukraine, and the European Union, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Canada, among others, imposed a series of economic sanctions with which they sought to cut off the financing of the war in Ukraine, doing as much damage as possible to the Russian economy.
The European Union and its partners are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine.
These sanctions packages included the freezing of $300 billion in reserves of the Russian central bank, the expulsion of its banks from the SWIFT system, and a strict control on imports from Russia and exports of technological and industrial components and products to this country. But what was initially estimated to cause the Great Russian Depression did not materialize, and Russia has been able to continue its military operations in Ukraine, while the places that imposed the sanctions have seen serious short-term problems, especially the European Union, but with the entire world economy being affected, because the reduction in Russian energy exports generated an increase in the prices of crude oil and natural gas in international markets, affecting even countries that did not trade these commodities with Russia. And the increase in the price of natural gas led to an increase and shortage of fertilizers, since it is its main raw material, and this, added to the decrease in food exports from Ukraine, has generated great pressure on food prices, which could see even more increases in 2023 when the full effect of fertilizers is seen. And although initially the Russian economy was affected and the Russian ruble plummeted to its lowest levels against the dollar, inflation shot up to more than 16%, and it was estimated that operations in Ukraine could not last long before destroying Russian finances. A reliable old ally came to save Putin. Russia is the second largest crude oil exporter, the third largest producer, and one of the countries that can produce it the cheapest in the world. This caused the sanctions to increase the price per barrel of Brent to go from being at $80 at the beginning of 2022 to around $120 a barrel in the second quarter of the year. Crude oil represents approximately 37% of Russia's export earnings, and with an estimated cost of production per barrel below $50, it was able to sell it to China, India, and Turkey at discounts of up to $30 per barrel and still earn enough money to keep its finances in order. The sanctions on Russia also meant that the country could not import a large number of products and services from the countries that sanctioned it. This generated the equivalent of forced savings for Russia, where it was able to continue selling, but not buying, shooting up its surpluses and being able to circumvent sanctions and continue the war in Ukraine, while running its economy in a stable manner, to some extent. And the International Monetary Fund, which estimated that the Russian economy would contract by 8.5% this year, modified its estimates to 6%, and now they are around 3 to 3.5%, in line with the estimates of the Russian Central Bank, which next year estimates an additional decrease between 1 and 4%. That, although far from being positive numbers, have been much less serious than expected. And Putin has taken advantage of this, because the war is not only on the military and economic level, but it is also an information war, and if the perception of the citizens is that the sanctions are affecting them more than Russia, they are going to put pressure so their governments end the support for Ukraine. However, it is too soon for Russia to claim victory, and the sanctions, which initially hit those who imposed them the hardest, especially Europe, are beginning to have an effect on the Russian economy. This materialized, not with an economic depression, but with an economic recession, which was entered when the economy contracted during the second and third quarters of the year, with annualized falls of 4.1% and 3.7% respectively, according to figures from the Russian government. And although at the beginning Russia was able to circumvent the absence of imports from the West with imports from China, inventories, dismantling planes, cars, and other products to have new spare parts, and adapting its industry, with the manufacture of automobiles, for example, being produced without air conditioning, emission controls, or airbags, shortages eventually began to hit their production lines.
Since you can buy everything, from nails to diamonds, you'll never produce your own. So the current situation is pushing us to work independently in many areas, including the production of our own scientific and instrumental base.
And most industries in Russia have seen reductions in their production volumes. Cameras, household appliances, paints, ceramics, metal products, textiles, batteries, furniture, electrical equipment, among many others, have seen drops in production volumes of 20% to 50% in the last year. And the ruble, that seems to be better than ever, is actually being artificially supported by the conditions that have been imposed on its companies to immediately exchange 80% of the money they receive in other currencies to rubles, increasing their demand, by capital controls that condition the exchange of rubles to foreign currency, and of course the limitation to use rubles for imports. On the other hand, crude oil prices have fallen more than 30% from their peak levels. The slowdown in China, the expectations of a crisis in 2023, and the readjustment of this market have ended up causing the price of crude oil to fall, and it is not impossible that it continues in this trend. Additionally, a moderate winter in Europe so far has caused natural gas prices to fall from the maximum points reached in August, reducing part of the pressure that has been generated on Europeans, especially in electricity, which reached €700 per megawatt in Germany, for example, when the average price in 2019 and 20 had been only €40 per megawatt. It is an irony that higher temperatures and not the wind turbines are the ones that are helping Europe, as if Germany needed any more reasons to burn coal. And although China has served to buy part of the commodities that are not longer being exported to Europe and provided part of the technology, spare parts, components, and others that Russia imported from the West, this solution is not so simple in the long run. It is no secret to anyone that China is going through internal problems, which, as the world's largest exporter, are aggravated by what has happened with energy and food prices and the slowdown in the world economy in general. And more than 20% of China's foreign loans for its Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to create a global infrastructure, are in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, with Ukraine's debt having become practically unpayable and that of Russia and Belarus with a higher risk than initially estimated. Furthermore, some companies are refusing to sell to Russia to maintain their reputation, and because the reality is that while China is Russia's biggest trading ally, Russia is China's 11th largest trading ally. So it is normal that companies from China, whose main customers are the United States or Europe, prefer not to risk their biggest market shares for Russia. Additionally, China's energy policy is based on maintaining diversified suppliers in order to avoid depending on just one, and so that no other country has power over them with something as valuable as energy security. And even if companies in China, whether because of government pressure or any other reason, decide to sell to Russia, the reality is that even the so-called world's factory does not produce everything that Russia needs for its economy to work normally, especially as far as technology is concerned, making China a great ally to mitigate their short-term problems, but not a total solution to them. And not being able to make the necessary investments, updates, and repairs in its productive fabric will have an effect on its long-term growth. That it is also being affected by the migration of young people due to the war, with unofficial estimates of between 250,000 and 500,000 leaving the country in the first 6 months of the invasion and 670,000 since the announcement of the partial mobilization in September. If the Russian economy is unable to make the necessary technology investments and also has a talent and labor drain, the disruptions in its supply chains could continue to worsen for a long time, even after the war ends. Because although some of Russia's exports could be restored, assuming political will, which is a big assumption, natural gas, for example, which represents around 6% of Russia's export earnings, may not be exported again for a long time to Europe at the same levels as before. Not only because of the diversification of suppliers that European countries have made through an increase in imports from Norway, Algeria, and Azerbaijan, but also thanks to imports of liquefied natural gas from the United States and Qatar. And no less important, the destruction of key infrastructure for the transportation of gas, with an indefinite repair time that could even be years or even require new infrastructure. And this is something that has particularly affected Germany, which built its industry on the base of cheap energy that imported from Russia, and now although it can supply part of the gas with Norway and liquefied gas imports, it is not at the same cost. And its heavy, energy-intensive industry is seeing its costs rise to levels that could no longer be sustainable or practical and lead to a migration of its production to countries with access to cheaper energy. For all this, it is false to assume that Russia has been immune to sanctions, even if they have not been as effective as initially expected. It is true that the sanctions have hurt Europe and the world in general enormously by not being able to count on the same supply of so many essential raw materials for energy and food production, but the effects they are having on the Russian economy could continue to accumulate in the long term. And if Russia, Europe, or the United States have been the most affected by the economic war, is highly debatable at this point, and I would like to know your opinion about it. See you next time.